Picture this. I pull into my driveway after 2 weeks on a remote job site. Boots still dusty, radio off so the silence can do its work, and my backyard looks like someone rented the place out for a season finale. White tents billowing, a champagne fountain doing its ridiculous glittering thing. By my grill, 200 strangers trampling my lawn, and a bride's veil snagged in my prized tomato vines like a flag at half-mast. The HOA president pearls posture, and that particular kind of entitlement strolls up like she owns the horizon and tells me with the sweetest condescension that I'm trespassing. Leave before you ruin the photos. Imagine being asked to leave your own house while your tomatoes watch you get evicted from your life. Yeah, that's how this whole thing began. My name's Hank Brewster. I'm a recently retired construction foreman, shaky-lipped from grief after losing Sarah, my wife, to cancer. And I moved into my grandmother's 1940s Craftsman in Willowbrook Estates to find quiet and a place to breathe again. The house sits on 2.3 acres, the biggest lot in the subdivision, oak trees that look like old centuries, honeysuckle that smells like a different, kinder decade, and a garden that made the county fair judge frown in a good way. It was supposed to be a refuge. Instead, it became a battleground. Priscilla Blackthorne arrived in a white BMW and a uniform of designer clothes and clipped vowels. 52, HOA, president realtor on the side, married to the developer's nephew, the kind of woman whose kitchen window had a perfect view of my property and who treated that view like holy writ. She came armed with a clipboard and a grin so practiced you could set a timer on it. "Mr. Brewster, your property violates 17 subdivision standards," she announced like she'd read them off a prayer card, mailbox, fence, shed, driveway, each infraction carrying its own weekly fine until I bent to her aesthetic dictatorship. 17 violations? Nearly $1,800 a week in penalties if I didn't comply. The smell of her perfume still sticks in my memory like a threat. Thing is, those features, my flag, the deck, the shed, they were older than the HOA's rulebook. They predated the people who now lectured me about curb appeal. So I did what any guy who can read a tape measure and knows a bad blueprint from a good one would do. I took a measuring tape and a camera and walked the neighborhood. What I found made me laugh once, and then it made my chest go cold. Identical fences, wider driveways, decorative nonsense galore, all overlooked. Priscilla's own rear addition sat 18 inches past the property line, her fence 4 inches over the legal height, landscape lighting that screamed Las Vegas at midnight, 0 violations on file. Consistency, it turned out, was something you applied only to the people you wanted to control. That's when a truth settled in. Like sediment. This wasn't about beauty or community standards. It was a squeeze-out operation. Force the originals to sell, carve up the land, and let the developers and their friends monetize every square foot. I should have connected those dots sooner. Hindsight is cheap, but it escalated fast. One morning I'm nursing coffee on the porch and 3 women in stilettos and measuring tapes descend like a municipal SWAT team. They photograph, they measure, they tally. 23 violations, nearly $2,000 a week. Pay or we place a lien. Foreclosure if you don't comply. The mailbox that had held my grandmother's letters suddenly became a weapon pointed at my mortgage. Old habits die hard. In my case, the habit of reading the fine print. I made a database at my kitchen table, GPS coordinates, photos, violation codes. I filed a formal complaint with the county planning department because municipal inspectors hate selective enforcement the way kids hate Brussels sprouts. 3 days later, Mr. Rodriguez from Municipal Code Enforcement drove up like a man who enjoys closing loopholes. He found 43 identical violations across the neighborhood, and he called it textbook selective enforcement. Fines, suspended foreclosure threats, voided the trucks of local authority rolling through my yard, felt for a moment like justice. Priscilla didn't go quietly. She had an army, her brother-in-law Marcus Esquire, who held legal threats like loaded phrases, and a network that could make intimidation look respectable. Legal letters, cease and desist, claims of defamation, stalking, interference with legitimate business operations, the kind of legal porn that costs more than common sense. My daughter Lisa, a mortgage broker who's seen more legal posturing than a courtroom stenographer, read the letter and laughed herself hoarse over the phone. "Dad, this is amateur hour intimidation," she said. Her laughter cut through the fear like a saw. So I followed the money, because budgets don't lie. The HOA had paid $67,000 in legal fees in 18 months, all to Blackthorn Legal Services. No bids, no minutes showing board approval. It smelled rotten. Then I found something even juicier in the courthouse basement, the original survey. My lot, the one I'd inherited and loved, belonged to the adjacent county township, not the subdivision. For 40 years, I'd been paying dues and obeying rules that technically didn't apply to me. Priscilla had been running a protection racket on land she had no authority over. Armed with old stamps and newer indignation, I hired Mrs. Kowalski, a retired surveyor who swears in Polish and knows how to make a corner stake tell the truth. She confirmed that my lot was not under the HOA's jurisdiction. That changed everything. This was no longer petty enforcement. It was fraud, plain and simple. Marcus's response was predictable file motions, call my actions, vexatious litigation cry, impartiality. Translation, we never checked and now you're dangerous because you read things. Word spread. Other original homeowners came out of the woodwork with stories about aggressive fines, threats, and worse. Mrs. Patterson had paid thousands for a pergola older than the subdivision. Mr. Ryan faced foreclosure threats for a garden shed that predated the bylaws. Patterns emerged like cracks in old plaster. The emotional soundtrack was crickets and gossip, but underneath it was the sound of a racket grinding against people who couldn't build a defense. Then the twist landed like a fist. Willowbrook wasn't just extorting homeowners, they'd been selling our yards as venues. I found event permits listing Willowbrook Manor Estate with my address tucked in like a typo. I found an incorporation for Willowbrook Event Planning Services with Priscilla's home address as the headquarters. Worse, cached marketing photos showing my oak tree and my deck liability insurance, listing my property as a covered venue, contracts for weddings with my address printed in professional font, and credit card records showing deposits flowing into accounts tied back to her operation. She'd been using inspection photos, the very photos taken under the guise of enforcement, to advertise and rent my property out for five-figure events. A kid named Tyler from Enchanted Events knocked on my door at 7 a.m. in a panic, holding a contract for a wedding that was supposed to be on my lawn that very Saturday. 200 guests, $15,000 down. He thought he'd been scammed. He had. But the contract had come from Priscilla, who'd been booking venues using photos she'd taken while pretending to be a code enforcer. The audacity was breathtaking. The fraud was paper thin, and everywhere insurance claims signed, waivers, deposits, and Tyler standing in my kitchen shaking became the human embodiment of that twist. Once you see the scam, the path is obvious. I rallied allies, Mrs. Kowalski with her transit equipment, Jake, an old demolition buddy who knows municipal emergency authority like a pastor knows prayer, my daughter Lisa handling legal logistics, and Mr. Rodriguez, who'd already tasted righteous municipal outrage. We coordinated real inspections, septic checks, structural assessments, health department involvement, everything that turns a stunt into a legal minefield. We called Channel 7 because if you're going to expose corruption, sunlight and cameras are your best disinfectant. Saturday morning we set the stage. Excavator parked where the tent aisle should have been, inspectors on site, health officials testing soil, and a news crew rolling. Priscilla tried the classic playbook: restraining orders, judicial favors. Judge Milhouse, apparently her golf partner, issued a temporary order protecting legitimate commercial operations. The deputy who served it read it like it was scripture. I handed him Tyler's contract with my address on it and watched his face recalculate. Priscilla escalated to vandalism, sending teenagers to sabotage Jake's equipment in designer heels, which, to be honest, was comedic if it weren't criminal. The vandalism actually strengthened our case. Sabotage on private property as evidence. Then came the political cavalry. Commissioners and representatives arrived, suits and smiles, waving paperwork that smelled like campaign contributions. They tried to stop the inspectors. They tried to make corruption look like due process on live television. That was their mistake. We had reporters, surveyor maps, insurance forms, credit card trails, and a demolition crew whose work orders read like gospel. Channel 7 pressed microphones into the faces of elected officials, and the sound of shoe leather retreating was glorious. County inspectors red-tagged the property for contamination risk and structural failure. Then, Jake's excavator, the most theatrical instrument in my toolbox, methodically tore out the unauthorized infrastructure, concrete platforms, tent anchors, a permanent outdoor kitchen, a decorative arch that had hosted a dozen stolen weddings. The machine made art of demolition while the cameras recorded. When the detective arrived with arrest warrants, handcuffs clicked and neighbors applauded, because sometimes justice needs a backhoe and a camera crew. Priscilla was taken away, charged with construction fraud, theft by deception, insurance fraud, and a string of felonies that made her business partner's legal bills look like monopoly money. Marcus found his law license on suspension and suddenly discovered that representing the family wasn't as glamorous when the state bar comes knocking. The aftermath felt like a well-earned exhale. Restitution paid to defrauded couples, seized assets used to fix the damage, the HOA dissolved and reformed as a transparent neighbors association with rotating potlucks and actual meetings instead of theater. We planted a veterans memorial with the money the crooks left behind. Jake's business doubled overnight because apparently people like contractors who use heavy machinery to take down fraud. Mrs. Kowalski, my surveyor with the Polish curses, got elected president by acclamation because she'd stood up and produced the receipts. What I learned, and this is the thing that sticks to your ribs, is that power without accountability becomes a corruption engine, and small kindnesses like paying attention and reading the fine print are sometimes the only tools ordinary people have to stop it. Transparency is a kind of civic muscle. Sunshine is not just poetic, it's practical. I also learned that justice can be messy and feel like revenge, and sometimes the two blur. But when you're protecting people from theft and fraud, there's a sweetness in the mess. So here's the question I want you to sit with, not to answer politely, but to argue about in the comments when someone uses their official power to steal from their neighbors. Do you call that vigilante justice when a neighbor uses legal tools and a backhoe to stop them? Or is it the only kind of justice left when systems get warped? Was what I did necessary, or did I cross a line? Tell me your take. Have you ever had to fight back against someone abusing a little power for big profit? Share your story. Drop your opinion. And if you think the Petersons deserve justice, share this and tell someone you know that sometimes a quiet old yard and a pile of tomatoes can be where the real battles for decency are won.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video. Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.